Good afternoon. Welcome to a special edition of InFocus. I'm Melissa Ridgen. December 15th, today marks the 5-year anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, put to all of Canada in the form of a very clear path forward to reconcile for the brutal legacy of residential schools on former students and the intergenerational trauma it continues to have on families and communities. But when the last of the sage burned out and the cameras turned off 5 years ago, what's happened? Today we are putting truth and reconciliation in focus. How is Canada living up to its commitment to implement the 94 calls to action? What have been the victories and the defeats? We are so fortunate to have all three commissioners here to dissect the past 5 years. And to kick things off, let's hear from them. A reminder that they spent 6 years traveling every corner of this country to gather stories from 6,500 witnesses. They hosted 7 national events across Canada to engage Canadians, to educate people about the history and legacy of residential schools, and to share and honor the survivors and their families' stories. All of that was the basis of 6 volumes of work culminating with the 94 calls to action. We begin with the former Chief Commissioner of the TRC, Murray Sinclair.
5 years ago today, I stood with the TRC commissioners to deliver a report and the 94 calls to action that we hoped would change the fabric of Canada forever and bring forward important changes in Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. In the 5 years that have followed the TRC, Canada has begun to grapple with the history and ongoing impacts of residential schools, and there has been important and encouraging pockets of change and action towards reconciliation across the country. We've seen promising changes, like new curriculum and courses in schools and universities that teach the history of residential schools in Canada. We've seen individual organizations and institutions take it upon themselves to implement the calls to action and incorporate things like Indigenous cultural competency training into their practices. Although positive, these initiatives have not been consistently implemented across the country, and we've seen pushback from some provinces in fully committing to and supporting their implementation. Overall, the federal government has been slow in implementing the TRC's 94 calls to action. During the TRC closing ceremony, we acknowledged that reconciliation was going to be hard and that it would take a long time. We did not and do not expect change to happen overnight. It is, however, very concerning to us as commissioners that 5 years later, the federal government still does not have a tangible plan for how they will work towards implementing the calls to action, and progress is not being tracked by any one federal department. When the commission ended, we emphasized that 2 things were crucial to our findings and the implementation of the 94 calls to action. Those 2 things are the adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation, and the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation as an independent body to track and report progress on all aspects of Canada's path to reconciliation. Implementing the UN Declaration should be a priority for all Canadians. Reconciliation is not a partisan issue. This work is the responsibility of everybody. Reconciliation requires dedicated commitments that result in actions across provincial, territorial, and federal governments. It requires cooperation and collaboration between political parties. It is more than just consultations with Indigenous peoples and organizations. It is true partnership that creates change across all sectors. The slow progress in implementing the UN Declaration, indeed the resistance from some quarters, is just one example of how there is a need to restore Canada's sense of urgency and unity in working towards implementing the calls to action. Residential school survivors have waited too long to see change in this country. Many of the survivors whose stories and work made the TRC possible have now passed on, without ever seeing the results of their labor. One of the main objectives of the TRC was to create a national memory of the history and ongoing impacts of residential schools in Canada. It is crucial that Canadians understand how residential schools forever altered the fabric of this country and its institutions. Canada must never forget what residential schools took from Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples, and what was done to the most vulnerable of all of us, all our children. To truly move forward, Canada must first have a deep collective understanding of this history that cannot be rewritten or erased by those that would rather forget it. We cannot get to reconciliation if we do not first grapple with and memorialize the truth. This work begins with education. The TRC final report provided Canada with a roadmap to address the history and ongoing impacts of residential schools, to tackle issues we continue to deal with today, like systemic discrimination and racism, to transform our institutions to be more equitable, just, and safe for our children. Read the final report and consider what you have the ability to take action on. We all have the power to make important changes in the places we live, the work we do, and the people we know and meet. That is the work of all Canadians. It is not too late for Canadians to commit to doing this work and redoubling their efforts to implement the calls to action. Canada owes it to residential school survivors to never forget what they heard. But more importantly, we owe it to our children and to our grandchildren, so that they can take what they have heard from them and from us and work towards creating a Canada that is more equitable and just for future generations. Thank you.
It's an emotional day for me today, the 5th anniversary of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the product of many, many voices of survivors, many visits to communities across the country, many ceremonies to honor the survivors, the intergenerational survivors, and those who lost their lives when they were at residential school as a result of the impacts of the residential school. I'm not only a commissioner, I was also a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Survivors Advisory Committee. I'm struck by the fact that there is much more work to do, but also feel a deep sense of accomplishment and pride at all the work that has been done. I'd like to speak a bit more about the UN Declaration. In our first principle of reconciliation, the TRC said that the Declaration is the framework for reconciliation. We referred to the Declaration and called for its implementation throughout all our calls to action. Canada made a big step forward with the recent tabling of Bill C-15, an act respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. However, this is just the first step in the parliamentary process. It's crucial that the bill comes to a vote and is adopted before this session of Parliament ends next year, and that does not leave us much time. I've devoted a large part of my life to advancing the UN Declaration, including decades at the UN and elsewhere. The UN Declaration represents a historic achievement for the global community. The way the states and Indigenous peoples were able to find common ground serves as an example for reconciliation in action. The UN Declaration recognizes that the right to self must no longer be denied to Indigenous peoples. It affirms our treaties and calls on states to uphold their obligations. It protects our inherent right to make our own decisions about our lands, territories, and resources. It recognizes Indigenous peoples as members of the human family. The UN Declaration is built on a premise of mutual respect and partnership. This is what we need to achieve reconciliation. That's why it's so disappointing to hear provinces say that the UN Declaration implementation legislation is moving ahead too fast. To those provinces, I say you are stepping squarely in the way of reconciliation. It's your efforts to deny the rights of Indigenous peoples that creates barriers to certainty and shared prosperity. When we can all agree that we want to live in a country that respects human rights, equality, and non-discrimination, justice and democracy, good faith and good governance. When all governments hold themselves to this standard, that's when we will see truth, reconciliation, justice, and healing, not only for ourselves, but also for Mother Earth. I know that as we look forward to the next 5 years, we will see more efforts towards answering our calls to action. We must keep this at the forefront of our agendas. Speaking as a former residential school student, it is critical that we do not lose momentum now. Every act of truth and reconciliation serves to heal the many deep wounds inflicted by the experience of the residential schools. At the same time, every act of dishonesty or dishonor throws salt on those wounds. We need to stay vigilant and ensure that we do not allow this to happen. I have been disheartened by some who say reconciliation is dead, which I don't believe. In fact, I'm very encouraged by the recent survey which found that 70% of Indigenous youth believe that they will see reconciliation in their lifetime. This is highly promising and hopeful, a hopeful sign for all Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians alike. I lift up my heart to the survivors and their families, and to each person who has put energy into the journey of truth, reconciliation, and healing. Hai, merci beaucoup, and thank you.
When we issued our 2015 final report and calls to action, none of us ever expected that 5 years later all 94 would be implemented. These calls outline a pathway for a profound transformation of Canadian society and relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Such fundamental work takes time. We accept that. However, 5 years later, we did expect to see real progress in laying the foundations for national reconciliation, and specifically the two missing pillars needed to support all the rest. Chief Littlechild has spoken about the first one, implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I want to talk about the other still missing pillar, the National Council on Reconciliation. Calls to action 53 to 56 are for the creation of an independent national oversight body, a cross-cultural council appointed jointly by Indigenous peoples and the Government of Canada. The council would ensure the development of a coordinated, multi-year national action plan for reconciliation, including research and education. The council would monitor and assess efforts throughout the country, sharing positive examples and identifying continuing gaps. The Council would report annually to Parliament, keeping Canada alert to and accountable for its commitments and obligations. And the Prime Minister of the day would respond publicly with an informed yearly snapshot of how this country is doing on the reconciliation imperative. We do honor and respect the many initiatives by individuals, institutions, and governments since the TRC. But these positive, singular efforts are not the complete picture. In the absence of a national council, there is no way for any one of us to know everything that's going on, positive or negative. In our Joint Commissioner's statement today, we lamented systemic racism in the healthcare system at the cost of human life, widespread poverty, food and housing insecurity facing First Nation, Inuit and Métis communities, continual high numbers of Indigenous children in care, and persistent Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. These glaring gaps still before us make the need for the National Council more apparent than ever. As we've imagined it, it would play a key role in ensuring a comprehensive and coordinated response to such pressing issues. And while we do note our understanding that the federal government intends to move forward with the National Council in the new year, for nearly 3 years we've been hearing that it's coming soon. Nearly 13 years ago, every national political party in Canada offered residential school apologies in the House of Commons, each one committed to reconciliation going forward. That is essential for the just and inclusive society Canada claims to be. A National Council for Reconciliation is a crucial tool to get us there. Today we call again for urgency. No more delays. Canada needs this. All Canadians need this. I also want to speak briefly of the most heartfelt of our calls to action, about the missing children. Canada kept shameful, incomplete records of children who did not survive residential school. Our TRC confirmed 3,200 deaths, but little more than half the identities. We applaud the continuing efforts by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation on the Student Memorial Registry. With help from survivors and families, that registry now names more than 4,000 children who never made it home from school. As this sacred work of finding the children continues, they will be further remembered as efforts continue this year towards a national monument for residential schools, and we look forward to that. As with all casualties of state-sponsored events, every lost child deserves remembrance. Every grieving family needs comfort, and every honorable country needs acknowledgement of truth. As a mother and grandmother, I cradle the memory of these children today. It's also very emotional to speak alongside my fellow commissioners. Together today, we remind you that reconciliation belongs to each and every one of us as individuals, as governments, and as citizens. Reconciliation is not dead unless we kill it through our own inaction.
We have to take a break, but when we return, the commissioners join us live to discuss the progress and the challenges, and we'll hear from survivors themselves, their perspectives on what's happened, what hasn't, and what needs to. Stay with us. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of InFocus. Joining us now, former commissioners Murray Sinclair, Wilton Littlechild, and Marie Wilson. Thank you all for joining us. I'll start with you, Mr. Sinclair. You said in your opening statement that progress has been slow, but there's been small and very important pockets of progress. You had also said part of the problem is that progress isn't being tracked. Can you kind of elaborate on that for us?
Well, one of the most common questions that we get as commissioners is what's the event, what's been going on, and who's doing what. Mm-hmm. And we, quite frankly, can't tell anybody because we don't have any single source where we can check. We know that there are events going on. We know that there are changes to school curriculums at the local level. We know that some of the school curriculum programs have undertaken to do changes to the curriculum at a provincial level, but some of that has come to a halt. We know that in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, that there's probably been more activity to ensure that education changes are being made. But in the other parts of Canada, we don't see the same effort being undertaken. I've spoken at many events where church congregations and community organizations have brought together Indigenous and non-Indigenous people for the purpose of discussing reconciliation, or talking about how they can change and improve their relationship. So we know that there are those singular events going on. We know as well that British Columbia, through its own legislation, has adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mm-hmm. But what is still concerning, of course, is that we see almost every day in the media activities going on in society that show that there is still an abundance of racism that's not being adequately addressed. Mm-hmm. There are issues around systemic racism that we need to come to terms with. We need to have a dialogue about ensuring that people understand how it works and what can be done about it. So there's still a lot of work left to do.
Yeah.
But there have been some pockets of activity that we can't ignore, and we have to give credit where credit is due, that some parts of society have been really endeavoring to do what they can.
Yeah. Ms. Wilson, you said that nobody thought that the 94 calls to action would be complete by now, 5 years later, sitting here saying, well done, washing our hands of it and moving on. But you did say that there's two missing pillars, UNDRIP implementation and the creation of a national council, which I guess that would be part of the, to Mr. Sinclair's point, nobody's keeping track of any progress. The national council would, I guess, be one facet of that, keeping track. What needs to come first, UNDRIP implementation or the National Council, or does it matter?
Your question, I just couldn't hear the last piece.
Yeah, sorry. So what needs to, does the National Council, we were talking about the two pillars that need to happen, does National Council have to come first, or UNDRIP implementation, or does it matter?
I don't think it does matter which comes first, but just to understand that both are essential. We've said that the UN Declaration really is a framework for understanding the spirit and purpose of all reconciliation and articulating its relationship to the rights in Canada and recognized within our Constitution as well. Mm-hmm. But the National Council is more of a, if I can put it this way, more of a practical day-to-day, year-to-year operational vehicle for all of us as a country to be able to pay attention to what's getting better, what may be getting worse, what are those things that we need to hold up to a light for celebration and cause for, yes, joy at the great things that have been done, and what are those areas where there's things may actually be getting worse and we need to figure out how we drill down and apply either more attention or more resources or whatever is needed. Mm-hmm. And without that, nobody has the complete picture.
Yeah.
And so we aren't learning from each other and we aren't learning from the realities.
Mr. Littlechild, you called out provinces who say that UNDRIP implementation is moving too fast. You had said, and I quote, "You're stepping squarely in the way of reconciliation. It's your efforts to deny the rights of Indigenous people I would ask you, Mr. Littlechild, do you think that a lack of understanding of what UNDRIP entails, and particularly, some of the buzzwords that maybe Indigenous people know and understand, but that non-Indigenous Canadians don't grasp, such as self-determination, fiduciary responsibility, free and prior and informed consent, things like that people, regular Canadians, maybe can't get their heads around, has maybe made it so that people don't understand it, so they don't apply pressure for politicians to implement it. Your thoughts, Mr. Wilson? Sorry, that was a really long, meandering way to ask a question.
Well, I said that they were standing in the way of reconciliation, and I mean that because when Canada finally endorsed and supported the reconciliation, the UN declaration, since that time the clock started running, and it's been 5 years for TRC and 10 years for the declaration. There's been a lot of time for provinces to become aware of the declaration. They make it sound like we just sprung it up on them 3 weeks ago or something like that. And I think that's just a cover-up for their not wanting to support either the declaration or the legislation. Some of them even divide it up into two. They say, yeah, we support the declaration, but we don't support the legislation. So they have to make up their mind in that regard. As far as right to self-determination, this is the most fundamental human right that every human in the world has. It doesn't say in the international covenants that Canada signed on to in 1976, all peoples have a right to self-determination except Indigenous peoples. It doesn't say that. So we had to get the declaration to catch up to the rest of the world so that A, we can be recognized as human beings, B, we can be recognized as having human rights, one of which is a right to self-determination that everyone benefits from. For many years since 1948, when the Universal Declaration was not adopted, or was adopted, we were not there. Nobody represented us, so we were left out. Consequently, when you look at the statistics around the world, thousands and perhaps millions of our people got killed, assassinated, for defending their lands, territories, resources, water, timber, because they were not considered human, so it was okay. Now, as far as free, prior, and informed consent, that's the very most mischaracterized part of the UN Declaration. They've done a very good job of calling it a veto. And when you look at all the 46 articles and the preambular paragraphs of the UN Declaration, you will not find that word veto in there. What it does, though, it calls on us to work together. Wherever you see the word veto in 9 articles, it's about working together on something, whether it's economic development or social development, parts of the right to self-determination, as you know, are economic, social, and cultural development. Indeed, there's 30 references to culture in the UN Declaration. And to look at that, plus our calls to action, saying this is the framework to reconciliation, what we're talking about in a final analysis is our survival, our dignity, and our well-being. That's what the UN Declaration is about, our survival, dignity, and well-being. And for those provinces who are objecting to that, that's what they're voting against. They're voting against you and your survival, you and your dignity, and you and your well-being. And I don't think that's right. I think that's very wrong to mischaracterize terms like free, prior, and informed consent, because that's not the truth. The truth is they're trying to protect their own provincial jurisdiction and lock us out. I'll give you a good example. In the letters to the Minister of Justice by the provinces, they said that we want to keep having our own private provincial government, territorial government meetings, we always invite the leaders to come in and say a few words. Yes, they do, but then they kick them out. And then they can go on and they say, then we can have a very frank and earnest discussion among ourselves. And then the next sentence, they say, we all have to be at the table at the same time. So it's a total contradiction in their position, in my view.
Yeah. I want to go now to, let's hear from a survivor, Wanbadi Wakita.
It takes a lot of effort and learning and understanding to know what this, first of all, the human being laws that are connected to the natural laws that are out there. And more importantly, how sacred laws are all connected to everyone. And so it's that time of the year again where we gather to make ceremony, to make sure that we cover everything, the teachings, the learnings, the understanding, the accepting of ceremonies. And we really need to go back, whatever it is that we're doing, we really need to go back to realize how important these ceremonies are. And with ceremonies, there's something called culture. And this culture is all of the language, the songs, the ceremonies, the prayers, history, education. It's all of those. So we are going back to that. Remember now that we're working with the holy ones, the spirits that are up there, which is a great deal part of what we're working with. The voices that we heard over the years, they're up there now, and they're listening to us, and we're asking for their help. And so that's an important kind of a path that we should follow.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, lots more discussion about where we're at in terms of implementation of the TRC calls to action and more words from survivors themselves. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Here's another survivor, Garnet Anjikaneb. Let's take a listen.
I often ask myself, do I feel more empowered? Do I feel more in control of my life as a result of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement? And I really, honest to God, wrestle with that question in so many ways. You know, as a survivor, we still hear about the governments fighting, for example, St. Anne's residential schools and fighting them in the court of law. Here in Northern Ontario, we still have unfinished business of dealing with the Law Society of Ontario, for example, that stem from the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The people continue to be harmed, people continue to be injured by the inactions of the Law Society here of Ontario, here in Northern Ontario. And so then, you know, what about the behaviors and the actions of someone like Senator Lynn Beck, who continues to spew out negative rhetoric about the Indian residential school system, and how those words and those behaviors impact at the community level. And so, you know, we've got a lot of work to do to restore relations, to build relations, even though we have a lot of good work that has happened to rebuild and to redefine our relations with Canada, with our communities, with our families, and indeed at the ground level of where we live in, whether it's in the cities or the smaller municipalities. I really praise the work and the efforts that have gone on for the last 10, 15 years, but we do have a lot of work to do. And so overall, what has this cost? What has this cost in terms of the price that survivors have had to pay, in terms of the suffering that they went through? And I'm not just talking about the financial costs. There are other costs associated with the legacy of the Indian residential school system.
Thanks for that. Mr. Sinclair, let's go to you then, to Garnet's point. You know, after all of this, was justice served for the survivors? I'm curious how you guys feel after going through all of this. That was it all worth it?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, it was. But I think the real question is, are we finished? And the answer is no. So until we finish, we can rightfully say that justice has not yet been reached. So I think that Garnet makes a very good point. There are still lots of work left to do, and it's up to us as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to make sure that it gets done. The problem that I see sometimes is that people think it's up to the federal government to do everything. But in reality, it's up to Canadians and it's up to Indigenous people themselves as well to do things. And I don't doubt for a moment that there is a level of frustration out there that we have not yet seen the kind of results that we were hoping for. And that's the very issue that we raised in our comments.
Yeah. Ms. Wilson, I'll ask you this question. We had a question from Jimmy DeRocher about many people who were not part of this, the day school survivors who were left out, and then there's, some of them are being dealt with in one capacity, and then others in a different one, and still others that are left out entirely. Jimmy DeRocher said, he would like to see commissioners kind of take this and kind of lead it, I guess, through as part of reconciliations to make sure that nobody else got left behind. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say that during our time with the Commission, when we were still active, we made a decision, an intentional decision internally, that even though some people were left out of the settlement agreement, we would not leave anybody out of our work through the TRC. And so we went to parts of the country where there were so-called excluded students. We were in many Métis communities, for example. We were in parts of Labrador and other places that had been excluded. And we basically said anyone who feels that they have something that they need to tell the Commission that will help with Canada's understanding are welcome to share with us. So we were not exclusive in that way. Having said that, I do think, and I've said this before, I think we may have made an error in under-calculating the extent to which there would be follow-up work in which we ourselves could be implicated. Just this very week and this coming back together as the three commissioners have, we were all noting it's the first time we've all had a vehicle for coming back together since the end of the commission. And our ongoing relationship with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has been intermittent. And so I think there are things that we are actively thinking about. Even yesterday having some discussions with Minister Bennett about some of these issues of ongoing momentum and how we stay in good communication and keeping momentum alive. These are active conversations, and I think they are very important because, as Senator Sinclair just said, absolutely the work is not done. We knew when we finished that it would not be done, but it definitely, there's a lot more to be done still.
Yeah. Mr. Little Shadow, I want to ask you, so going back to something you said in your opening statement, you said that every single act of reconciliation done by Canadians serves to heal the wounds of the residential school system, and every act of dishonesty and disorder pours salt in those wounds. My question to you would be, has there been more healing or has there been more salt in the wounds from your perspective over the last 5 years?
Well, I suppose it varies with individual to individual in terms of whether they feel more harmed now, in terms of more wounded, in terms of salt, as I used as an example. But can I just make two comments before I come back to that? I wanted to respond to the first survivor who spoke, because I want to underscore that when we went to the UN for 27 years and 10, 12 years after that in New York, we didn't always go and ask for stuff or ask someone to recognize our rights. We contributed a lot to the humankind, the world. And let me just give you one example that he raised when he talked about natural and sacred laws and ceremonies being bundled up in our culture. The UN and the international community only recognized 5 bundles of rights: economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights. And those are divided up into 2 international covenants. Now, what was missing there was spiritual rights. And it was not until Indigenous, our sacred leaders, spiritual leaders, brought the issue of spirituality to the UN, that the world finally recognized that there is such a thing as having a right to spirituality. And that was a contribution the elders made to the world. The other contribution they made that's obvious, especially in a situation today as we speak, there's a conference going on climate change. The protection of environment, Mother Earth, and stewardship of environment is another contribution Indigenous peoples made. The recognition of Indigenous law, Indigenous family, Indigenous spirituality, as I said, Indigenous spiritual connection to the land, those teachings were contribution to the world that the elder was talking about. Now, when you ask, I think it was Garnett, about healing, it was a very difficult mandate for us to go from truth and then immediately to reconciliation, because it's a spectrum. Everyone has a right to know the truth. Then we have an apology, but there was never really an opportunity given or extended to forgive. Some of those that wanted to give forgiveness to those that harmed them. Then you begin to feel a sense of healing. And once you do that, then you begin to feel a sense of justice. Then, as a combination of all of that, you can go to reconciliation. So it's a spectrum, and healing is only one step of the way. As far as harm and wounds, don't forget I spent 14 years of my life in 3 different residential schools. And I can tell you it took me an awful lot of work and counseling to try and get myself to a healing position, a healing. I'm not saying I'm healed, but I'm still working on it on a daily basis. So there are those that have been wounded very seriously by what happened to them as children. And when you lie about this history, when you say it's a fad, when you say it didn't happen, then I think you're pouring salt into the wound, and that's very harmful to the survivors that have experienced, especially negative experiences in the residential schools.
Yeah. Okay, we need to take another break. We still have a lot more ahead, including, is reconciliation dead? I know that's something that you spoke about, Mr. Littlechild. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on that. We have a lot more from survivors as well. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Let's take a listen now to another survivor.
Hi, everyone, and good day. On behalf of my Inuit nations of Nunavut territory, of course, it is my honor to express my heartfelt gratitude for the work done through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on this 5th year anniversary. Although I always knew that it would be difficult for many to share their painful experiences. The dedication and compassion of the commissioners that helped us voice our voices, strength to resolve to share our truth. For many survivors, the Truth and Reconciliation was the first time we heard and the first time we were believed. It is important to honor the words of those who shared their experiences. I believe we do this by teaching the history of residential schools in all Canadian schools. My question to the commissioners is, I had to think about this part because I feel there's not many survivors left. It's important to remember all the survivors. And the question I had was, how can TRC commissioners, how could they further help us, the survivors, to better their life? Because sometimes we feel sad, and those experiences and those things that had happened in the past.
So, Ms. Wilson, I guess I'll put that to you. What, to Levita's point, is this something that a national council would be useful in? We've got survivors who are saying, we poured it all out, and now we kind of feel, in addition to the pandemic, just kind of left twisting out there without support. Is this something a national council would be helping with?
Well, it is something that a national council would play a role in, because they would be able to tell us where there are activities going on that are in fact addressing some of the concerns and the needs that Lavinia is talking about. One of the things, for example, in our calls to action, and we always talk about the 94 calls to action, some of the 94 calls to action are actually repetitive of 20 other calls to action that were described in our interim report. And one of the ones that was very particular there had to do with the need for ongoing healing supports and healing services, and indeed healing lodges. We talk about that in the context of correctional facilities, but we also talk about it in the context of healing programs closer to home, particularly for those in northern Canada who have to go so far away to receive any kind of residential or continuous care. And the reason I think that's so important is that when you bring it back to the commissioners and say, what can we do to continue to help? I think it is fair to say that each and every one of the three of us is trying in the ways we can, through the influence that we have and through the activities that we're involved in, to keep the conversation alive and to keep reminding people of their promises and their obligations. But I think also were those things that happened during our commission that people found so helpful. And one of the really simple ones was just that of creating space, sharing circles, convening opportunities for people to sit together and to hear each other and to be inspired and encouraged by each other. And some of that, and it's what Senator Sinclair, I think in part was referring to when he said, what is the leadership that Indigenous peoples and communities have to take on themselves? Right. Some of that, and COVID notwithstanding, don't do it now, but when we can, to think about ways and places that we might come together and be of support to each other as well. So we'll continue our part, and communities have to feel confident. They've already demonstrated so much courage that they also have things to contribute themselves, and being there for each other.
Mr. Sinclair, I'll ask you this. In the past 5 years, you had said earlier, this isn't just about what can the federal government do. That's just one element of what needs to happen. But I would ask you, what are you most pleased with that you've seen from Canadians in terms of reconciliation in the past 5 years? And I guess then conversely, what would be something in the past 5 years that you've seen that's been incredibly disappointing to you?
Well, probably the area where I think there's been most work that's impressed me has been with teachers. Yeah. Teachers have really taken to the need to change the way they educate children, students, about the history of Canada, about what a residential experience was like. They've been doing it without necessary curriculum materials in many cases, but they have outside resources that they've been able. We speak to a lot.
Oh, I think we just lost Mr. Oh, there.
An element of. Sorry. Did you miss some of that? All right, thank you. But there's a lot of outside resources that teachers can rely upon. I get requests all the time for reading lists for teachers, and I would say that it's the work that teachers are doing to change the way that children are educated, so that children themselves can develop a relationship early on and can maintain that relationship of respect further on into their lives. Now that needs to be nurtured, and that needs to be given more effort further along the line. And it's when you get into the high school years and the university years where that appears to lose some momentum. So we still need some work to do there. But that's the one area where I've always hoped that there would be growth, and I think there's also been a lot. And that's university scholars as well who are doing some writing in this area. The one area that probably disappoints me the most is that the federal government itself, which bears a significant responsibility when you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It speaks about the responsibility of nation states to come to terms with the fact that they are largely responsible for the destruction of Indigenous cultures, Indigenous societies, Indigenous landholding rights, and all of their legal rights as original peoples, and that they have to recognize that they paid a lot of money in order to do that. They spent a lot of money to bring in settlers. They spent a lot of money in order to take up lands and to support those immigrant populations that are coming in to take over those resources. And they financed the capitalists who were mining the resources and cutting the timber, digging for the gold and digging for petroleum. And they spent a lot of money to do that, and now they have to recognize that they need to also make a financial commitment to reconciliation as well. And it's in the UN Declaration that was.
Oh, he's back. Oh, he's frozen. Sorry, we've got a technical difficulty with Mr. Sinclair. Mr. Littlechild, just very quickly, we have to go to a break here, but I did want to bring up with you something that you had said in your opening statement. You said that it bothers you when people say that reconciliation is dead. We only have probably about a minute before we have to go to a break. Can you kind of quickly say what you were talking about when you say it bothers you when people say reconciliation is dead? Nope. I think we've lost Mr. Littlechild as well. You know what? Why don't we just go take a break right now? We can get our technical glitches all sorted out. When we come back, we're going to talk about the thousands of children who died and vanished at residential schools. And of course, we'll hear from more survivors on this 5th anniversary of the TRC's final report. Please stay with us.
Greetings. I'm Lila Breer, and I'm originally from Couchiching First Nation, and I'm happy to be here today and to share more or less a comment with you in regards to residential school survivors and the pandemic. And I'm speaking specifically with the northern and northwestern Ontario. And because I went to residential school at St. Margaret's Residential School in Fort Frances, Ontario, and and I think of them about what they've been through, what they're going through right now as far as the COVID-19 goes, and what they're going through, and so just I guess I'm thinking, right off the hop, I'm thinking about a question like, how is how are you handling what's going to happen with survivors, as far as the pandemic goes? Like, how can we help them? And the way that I've been doing it is by, talking to survivors on Facebook, and there's some of them that I went to school with that I'm in contact with, and and ask them how they're doing. And I talk a lot about depression, and they share with me, that they're going through the same thing because, there's triggers going on, and there's no help out there. There's no counselors or anyone for them to talk to, except maybe their the extended families, that are that are survivors. So I have a concern for them because, what can we do as far as reconciliation goes? To help these survivors. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to greet you today.
Welcome back. We have another survivor, Phyllis. Let's take a listen to her.
Hi, my name is Phyllis Gugu. I am an Indian residential school survivor who attended the Indian residential school in Nova Scotia. This year in particular has hit survivors twice as hard due to the pandemic, social distancing requirements, and once again, we are separated from our families. Survivors are still in need of healing. It's critical that survivors are not put on the back burner. So I would like to ask the commissioners, how can Canadians continue reconciliation efforts when so many are concerning about the economic climate?
Mr. Littlechild, I wanted to ask you, I'd asked before the break, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'll go back and ask you the question again. You said that it bothers you when you hear people say that reconciliation is dead. I want to know how come.
First, I was thinking that it's a shame that I've wasted 6.5 years of my life if reconciliation is indeed dead, because that's not what we were working for. Mm-hmm. Some people say, how can we have reconciliation when we didn't even have conciliation? Others say, what's reconciliation mean? And if you say, well, it's 3 R's, restoring respectful relationships. And that's very action-oriented phrase. And then they ask, what about the fourth R, revenge? After how you were treated as a child, how come you don't have any feelings for revenge? So it's a difficult topic in the sense of how you come at it. But for me personally, I was very disappointed to hear our own people say that, because it's also been said if it's going to die, it'll be us that'll kill it. So when I talk to my colleagues sometimes, my fellow chiefs, I say to them, we have to begin practicing the politics of hope. And by that I mean we have to give hope to our people through our leadership, especially the young people. Give them a hopeful future to look towards and go forwards, rather than other options that they may choose to pick if they've lost hope already. So it's what I meant by not agreeing with reconciliation being dead, because I see it being acted upon every day, at least around me, in different places I go.
And it's not perfect, right?
It's not, but at the same time, we knew that it wasn't going to be short-term activity either, reconciliation. It's going to be a long time. I remember someone saying it took us 7 generations to get here. It'll take us 7 generations to heal. So hopefully, of course, I pray and hope that it doesn't take us that long to see reconciliation, true reconciliation happen. But I wanted to also make a comment on the importance of focusing on mental health, especially during this time of the pandemic. And the last speaker talked about it in a very good way, that we were not only separated from our families, we were separated from our community, we were separated from the land, and now we're separated from family again. So it's so any kind of treatment, and by the way, culture is treatment, we need to focus on that part as well, so that her advice about just contacting and phoning someone to ask how they're doing does wonders for their mental health. So it's in a way a team effort to do that. But let's not be the ones that kill reconciliation.
Ms. Wilson, I wanted to go to you too. Something that you had said that really hit me when I heard you say it. The missing children who were taken to residential schools never returned home. You know, this country didn't even value them enough to document most of that. You've mentioned that that's not how honorable countries act. You know, is Canada now doing enough to act honorably, to honor those children and their loved ones?
Well, I think to this point, most of the practical credit goes to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and the efforts that they have made with federal financial support, for sure, an infusion of federal monies, to allow them to really dig into the archives and literally, I hate to say it, but piece together the fragments of storyline of the children who died in the schools. And that's how we've come to know the names. But we don't have all the information about these children, and we certainly don't know yet where all of them are buried. So the work is ongoing, and I know that there is work being done within the federal government to figure out how to move forward with that piece. But again, we've talked all day about the issue of urgency, because the survivors are aging and they need some peace around these things that truly are at the heart of individual and family well-being and coming to terms with the realities of their losses. So I think there needs to be renewed effort on that front and timely effort. I think it needs to involve all parts of the country. That can't be done in a sort of centralized way. And it needs to be done with the reverence that we would for any other context in which we take care of the fallen. We have only to look at military losses to know how we take care of that as a country. And we surely can do far better with our own children. So we have a lot of catching up work to do there. Can I just also say on your earlier question, Melissa, about reconciliation and what Chief Littlechild was saying, we need to remember when we're tempted to be disdainful of the word reconciliation, I think it's not the word itself, it's the frustration at the slowness of things, the perceived slowness of things. Because we have to remember that it was the survivors themselves who gave us that term to work with. They were the ones who fought through the courts and got this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a hard-fought term of the overall settlement agreement. And that was the terminology we were given, and they described it not as a quick fix, not as a definition, not as a recipe, but as an ongoing individual and collective process that would involve the survivors for sure and their families, that would involve the churches, that would involve the governments, and that would involve the people of Canada. And for me, that's the important thing that we have to constantly come back to and remind ourselves. This is not an Indigenous issue for Indigenous people to muddle their way through in isolation. It is for the country to take this on and to realize that we need to take practical steps and we need to treat it with the urgency, if I can put it this way, as if it were, as it is for so many of us, as if we were dealing with our own family members, and to treat it therefore urgently and with respect.
I love that. And I love the point you made about, look how we treat people who serve in our military, have a little bit of that dignity as well. We're going to take a quick break. I've got a couple pretty heavy questions for you guys when we come back. We're going to hear about, how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the work you guys did, how does that carry with you every day? I'm sure there's lots to talk about that. And also next steps. Where do we go from here? So stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Lastly, this is our final block before we're done here. I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Mr. Sinclair. 6 years of doing this, lots of work, lots of heartache to listen to. What have you carried with you from this? What still stays with you?
Well, probably the understanding that this work was something that was destined to take place, and that therefore we were in many ways fortunate to be asked to do it, because we were all very strong spiritually and emotionally, people that were able to be prepared to undertake this work. So working alongside my colleagues was probably the highlight of this whole process, because in many ways we had to rely upon each other. We had to get through this together. When we started out, we knew, and I'd forewarned them because of experience that I'd had with other inquiries that I had done, that you have to prepare yourself for what it is you're going to hear. And we have to understand that when we make a commitment to the survivors to see this through to the end, that we have to hold to that commitment. So we can't afford to fail, because if we fail, we not only fail ourselves, but we fail them as well. And so when I was finished with this, I was quite exhausted, and I think probably my colleagues were too. And I had made a commitment that I was going to step back from public life and give more time to my family, because they had given up a lot in order for me to do this, but also they were probably I thought then, and still do think, as it's turned out, they were going to become a huge source of comfort for me coming out of this, because they were with me the whole time that we were doing this.
Ms. Wilson, what effect did this have on you personally, this journey?
Was that for Chief Littlechild? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear where that was directed.
That's for you, Ms. Wilson. What did this journey, what was the effect that it had on you personally?
Well, on a day-by-day basis, as it was unfolding, I can tell you there were days that were ravaging. And it is true what Senator Sinclair has said, that we relied on each other and we held each other up, and we each had spiritual supporters as well, advisors who helped us on that level. But what kept me and sustained me always was the example of the survivors themselves. I would often say to myself, all I have to do, all I have been asked to do, is to bear witness to this and to make sure that it's understood and never forgotten by those who need to learn. I didn't have to live it, and It was little children who lived it. And so I need to keep that as a grown-up in perspective, and not think of my role in this as having been anything other than a sacred trust and an honor and a commitment that I made, that I would continue advancing the stories and the teachings and the expertise of survivors for as long as there was breath in me. And so I have tried on a daily basis in various ways since then to keep that promise, and to continue to be inspired, as my colleague Chief Littlechild was talking about, the leadership of hope. Yes, hope was a very big part of what kept us going, and we also saw it on display in exemplary ways, as one survivor's courage would serve as encouragement to the next one, even those who didn't intend to speak and who ended up coming forward, and therefore setting down loads that they'd been dragging around for decades. So I think we have to continue to be that to each other, and we have to help Canada learn its lessons by continuing to teach them in the ways that we can.
Mr. Littlechild, what, the 6 years you spent gathering these stories, what was the net effect on you personally?
Well, I, first of all, didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be a commissioner, but I never really knew why until a couple of years into the journey, because I was hearing my own story repeated over and over again in front of me. The abuse, the physical, the mental, the psychological, the spiritual, the sexual abuse that happened to me. I was hearing that in front of me all the time, every single day. So I still wear that. I still wear that part of the journey personally today. Also, to have the government deny that 3 years of my life in one boarding school didn't exist, that there was not a boarding school. So that what made me very angry, and had to really deal with my anger through some very, very good and strong counseling. So, but what I take away from it on a positive side is when somebody said that there's the 7 most powerful words I can leave with you is that I'm sorry, I forgive you, and I love you. And I try to share that now today with my family every chance I get, because that's something that was kept away from us, that emotion of love. And like I say, I still wear it today. I'm still working on it daily. So it was a difficult journey for me at times, but luckily with my colleagues, as they said, we held each other up, and that's what helped us go through this very difficult time.
Very quickly, I'll ask each of you one more question. What would you, we've been 5 years. Mr. Sinclair, what do you want to see happen in the next 5 years? We've got about probably 3 minutes left, so that's about a minute to each of you.
I just wanted to say in response to the last question that one of the more motivating comments that I heard with one of the survivors was the late Isabel Knockwood, who used to say to us, happiness is my revenge, when she talked about her experience in schools, and I always was motivated by that. So I think so your last question is which again?
What, very quickly, what do you want to see happen? What's the most important thing that could happen in the next 5 years?
Well, next 5 years, I think we need to have the Council for Reconciliation in place. I think we need to get the UN Declaration in place. I think we need to begin the legislative change process that's necessary. And I think that government needs to develop a plan about moving reconciliation forward at the national level.
Ms. Wilson, what would you like to see biggest priority to happen in the next 5 years for you?
Well, I'll just say ditto to those for expediency, but adding in that we would have had at least a couple of cycles of annual reporting State of the Nation back from the Prime Minister of the day, so that the whole country becomes normalized in understanding that this belongs to all of us, and that becomes a regular expectation that we will take stock of ourselves and figure out where we need to do better. And also that all the little children will be found, and that we will have a magnificent national monument for residential schools in the national capital that is there to remind everyone, to teach everyone, and to offer solace to everyone on a regularized basis. Those are practical things I would like to see.
Not unreasonable. Mr. Littlechild, what would you say your biggest priority is, what you'd like to see in the next 5 years?
In the last at the United Nations, when the UN was adopting the UN Declaration, after it was adopted, I asked myself, and notwithstanding Canada had voted against it, now what? And in 2008, I made a list of next steps of what had to happen. And the first one about governance was for Indigenous Peoples, tribes, and nations to adopt and implement the Declaration themselves. Secondly, to include it in their constitutions, for example. And I'm seeing that happen, which is absolutely amazing. The third one is fairly difficult right now because it works on having the regional, state, and provincial municipal governments support and endorse the Declaration. The fourth one is underway, which is to get the federal government to ensure that there's new legislation introduced, adopted to implement the Declaration. Fifthly, we need to utilize all relevant parliamentary and legislative committees. At the academic level, also it's happening. The UN Declaration has to be in the curricula at all schools and colleges, teaching the Declaration. At the local level, the very most important level is to educate our own people about the UN Declaration, so that not only members and staff in our governments and administration understand what it is, and for private industry to ensure that in their policies and core operational activities, for example, that they too adopt the UN Declaration and provide education for their management staff. I wrote that in 2008 after the Articles of Declaration were adopted.
We're going to have to wrap it up there.